Greetings, Earth and Space Explorers. Welcome to Doc Waller's Earth and Space Report for Friday, June 24, 2022. I'm your host, Bill Waller, an astronomer, science educator, and communicator, coming to you on a balmy summer evening in my hometown of Rockport, Massachusetts. These Earth and Space Reports are intended to engage and inform people like you who are curious about Earth as a planet, who care about our life-sustaining environment, and who wonder about the greater cosmos, including our place in space and moment in time. Video recordings of these reports are archived on the Earth and Space Reports YouTube channel. They are also in regular rotation on the 1623 Studios community access cable television channel. I am grateful for the continuing interest and support shown by Rockport educators and students, Cape Ann cultural colleagues, cohorts of the Gloucester Area Astronomy Club, sundry Earth and space scientists, far-flung friends and family, and other curious folk. Thank you for participating. This evening, we will head to the tropics with a talk by Greg Powell on mitigating climate change through tropical reforestation. Greg is the executive director of Reforest the Tropics. He has been with the organization since 2013. Greg has dedicated his career to addressing development needs in Latin America. Starting with the Peace Corps in Honduras, he then lived in and worked extensively in Belize, Peru, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic for most of his career. Greg holds a master's degree in diplomacy from Norwich University, which I'm sure has come in handy on the international stage. Given the urgency of our global climate challenges, his work is all the more important for us to learn about. So without further ado, the Zoom platform is all yours, Greg.
Thank you very much, Bill. And I'm not sure if anybody's picking this up, but we just started having a downpour here where I'm located in Rhode Island. So if you can hear the rain hitting my windows, please raise your hand and I'll try to adjust my volume. Okay, I think we're good. Okay, as Bill mentioned, I'm the executive director of Reforest the Tropics, and today I'm going to share with you a little bit about our work in Costa Rica and a little bit about the need for tropical reforestation in general. So if you bear with me for one moment, I'm going to open up a presentation. Okay, can everybody see that? Okay, so Reforest the Tropics. As the name implies, we're dedicated to reforestation, specifically in the tropics. And the idea behind our organization is carbon capture through biomass sequestration, obviously in the form of trees. And through many years, we've developed what we consider and what the literature supports as the world's most powerful carbon capturing forests. I'm going to talk a little bit more about Reforest the Tropics in a moment, but I always like to start with this slide, which is a justification for tropical reforestation as a climate mitigation tool. Now, I'm sure everybody on this call is aware that the sort of internationally recognized goal for our climate, our atmosphere in terms of carbon dioxide load is 350 parts per million. This is the goal. This is what's going to keep us at less than disastrous levels. We'll still have some, effects on the Earth if we maintain 350 parts per million, but this will keep us below the 2 degrees Celsius threshold. Unfortunately, we are well beyond that already, and it's growing. In November 21, excuse me, measurements indicated that we're a little over 415 parts per million. So there's a lot of excess CO2 in the atmosphere. What the science is showing us is that because of the residency rate of CO2 in the atmosphere, this excess CO2 is not going to dissipate quick enough on its own. In other words, we need to have some interventions to take this excess CO2 out of the atmosphere. If you look in the bottom left of this graph, you'll see a small yellow circle, and that's kind of what we're adding to the atmosphere each year. And, we're actually adding quite a bit more in terms of emissions, but, there are some natural sinks that take up a lot of this. So in terms of what we add to the actual atmosphere, it's about 3 parts per million. Now, most of the focus in terms of climate mitigation is on that yellow circle there. The funding and a lot of the attention is going towards efficiency and emissions reductions, and these are all critically important. However, what I like to remind people is we still have this historic CO2 load that needs to be addressed. And again, we need negative emissions technologies to actually extract the CO2 from the atmosphere. And I will argue today that tropical reforestation is the best tool that we have to do so. Now, the public and scientific community is starting to realize and recognize that these negative emissions technologies are critically important. I'm seeing a lot more attention being given to programs like ours and other approaches. But we're still not doing enough. So why aren't we planting more trees? Primarily, it's a question, like always, of economics. What we've seen as the biggest obstacle to reforestation has been the economic needs of landowners. Now, if you think about where most of the deforested land around the world, and especially in the tropics, it's actually in private hands. The governments and national parks and those things tend to have the already beautiful forested lands, whereas private landowners have deforested in the past for any number of reasons: urbanization, agriculture, etc. So that's really what we have to target to plant enough to make a meaningful difference. So a lot of attempts have been made over the years. And what we've landed on, unfortunately, is a predominantly monoculture approach. I've done a lot of research on this, and I've never found any publication that has really specific citations, but based on what I've read, I would guess roughly 70% of all reforestation is in the form of monocultures. Now, this is planting a single species, of course, and it's essentially farming timber. If you look at, I'd invite people to look at some of these large reforestation projects. Every once in a while, you'll hear something come up. Recently in Ethiopia, another one in China, and really all over the world about massive reforestation plans. And when you dig down into the details, you'll see blocks and blocks of these different monocultures. There's a reason for that. Monocultures are known. When you plant diverse forests, there's a lot of variables, and it's quite tricky. It's not as simple as planting trees and walking away. So with the monoculture approach, the growth curves are relatively well known, but more importantly, in terms of gaining engagement from these tropical landowners is the income potential. So, these markets are fairly well established. In Costa Rica, the most typical monoculture we see is a species called Malina. It grows really fast. It does have a market, and farmers know how to participate in such a project. If you look at the graph to the left, this shows the general approach, and you do have a baseline of carbon capture. In the Malina plantation, it's around 200 metric tons, but it works in cycles. So one rotation is planted. After about 12 years, it's cut. You plant another one on the same land, cut it. And if you follow this path forward, per the guidelines, you can count the average carbon increments on that land as sequestration. This, of course, gets costlier and costlier as time goes on. The carbon level stays the same, but each time you plant, it's a new investment. So we feel like there's a better approach. I added this slide specifically because this is an Earth and Space series, and more reasons why we're not planting more trees. I wanted to call attention to the albedo effect, and I suspect some on this call know of the albedo effect, but for those who don't, it is a measure of the reflectivity of the Earth's surface. So when we think about planting a dark canopy of trees, that will actually absorb heat. And depending on where you're planting on the planet, that can have almost negative or adverse effects in the climate equation. So, for example, if scientists have indicated if we were to plant forests on the Canadian tundra, as an example, like an extreme example, right, where most of the year that surface is going to be either snow covered or maybe some light grasses in the summers. And it's not going to absorb a lot of the sun's energy. Well, if you replace that with a very dark coniferous canopy, it's going to absorb enough heat that it will counteract any of the gains made from the carbon sequestration in that area. I had mentioned the economic realities, which is why we have the monoculture approach. I also feel like there's a lack of understanding of the real potential that we have with tropical reforestation. Part of that is we have a history of failed models with reforestation and other models that just are not optimized for carbon capture. So typically you'll see in the literature, a tropical reforestation project will be able to sequester annually about 8 up to 12 metric tons per hectare per year. Some of the newer models and the RTT model in particular is able to sequester double that, 24 metric tons per hectare per year. So based on this, this, I guess, faulty information, I think people are discounting what tropical reforestation can really accomplish. And then the other common argument I hear was if we supplant this agricultural land with trees, we're going to have problems feeding a growing population. And that is a legitimate concern. But again, I think many of these fears are based on the historical 8 to 12 metric tons per hectare as opposed to what we can accomplish with the RTT model. And to highlight that point, this recent article came out, and I do see these from time to time, again, discounting that reforestation is not the path forward. In this particular article, they assumed 3 to 4 metric tons capture per year. And again, we can drastically improve on that. We do grow in the tropics. Trees grow much faster in the tropics, obviously. So here's some photos just to highlight. On the left here, we have one of the eucalyptus varieties that we use. The difference between those two pictures is 6.5 years. Quite remarkable growth. And then the two photos to the right, that's the same road and just over 5 years difference. Okay, so let's talk more about what we are seeing with reforestation. Ideally, we're going to have natural forest analogs. This is copying what exists in any given ecological system. So you're using native species, you're contributing to that ecology. The downside to that is it is pretty inefficient in terms of carbon capture. That's where you're getting that 3 to 5 metric tons per hectare per year. If you're working with private lands, that's just not going to be enough. That's not enough capture for those landowners to make it worth their while in terms of either carbon credits or timber. So what we're seeing more commonly is monoculture. And this monocultures are actually, they can be efficient with carbon capture. About maybe 10 years ago, Costa Rica, where I work, a really progressive country in terms of their environmental awareness, they came up with a national plan to go carbon neutral by 2021. Spoiler that they did not meet that, so they've recalibrated that goal to give them a few more years. But the point is that they had this national goal, and tropical reforestation was a huge part of getting there for them. So they got together with the many great scientists within the country, consultants through both the World Bank and the United Nations, and the design that they came up with to plant, most of their reforestation was going to be in the form of monocultures. And again, that was the way that they were able to engage these private landowners, get them to actually plant, and they were willing to accept the downsides of such an approach. So briefly, I want to talk about Reforest the Tropics and just give you an idea of how we started. We were founded, well, the research was started in 1961 by Dr. Herster Barris. He was working as a UN FAO forester based in Costa Rica. And just as this was a time when Costa Rica was being deforested, and he had a personal interest, just, how can I create a forestry model that works as, in much the same way as agriculture would? So his academic interest was to create a mixed species model that would maximize biomass in a given area, with the idea that farmers could plant trees instead of, any number of other agricultural alternatives. And the reason why this is important is because forestry is a long-term research proposition. So the decades and decades of a head start before climate change was even, part of our awareness, really became meaningful in the model that we are able to deploy now. Years later, in the 90s, his work was known, and he was invited by the Clinton administration to submit a project for the newly formed climate mitigation program that they had. The project was accepted by the UN FCCC. It was through a program called Activities Implemented Jointly. And then we received approval from the Costa Rican government and the US government to work on this project. Unfortunately, the funding never came. So Reforest the Tropics was born as a nonprofit based on that proposal. And we have based our program on 3 key research goals. One is carbon sequestration. So the idea is that, again, we wanted to double what was sort of available to landowners at the time. And for us, that meant sequestering at least 500 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per hectare in 25 years. That's an average of 20 metric tons per year. We have since gone through third-party independent verification, and that process has revealed that our forests, on average, are sequestering 24.8 metric tons per hectare per year. So we're able to exceed that goal. The viable economic land use, again, going back to the idea that we need to create a land use alternative that makes sense financially for these families. In Costa Rica, our target is cattle. We want to start with the lowest amount of biomass in any given site where we're planting to enhance additionality. So we looked at cattle farming as the benchmark for our competition in terms of economics. And what we found through our model is landowners can generate on average about $450 per year per hectare through the initial 25-year contract period. Now, I do mention 25 years. Our forests are quite young at 25 years. However, again, through trial and error and years of experience, we found that 25 years is about the maximum that we can get a landowner to sign on to an initial project. After the 25-year period, the idea is to enter into another 25-year contract and so on, which gets us to our project permanence research goal. The forests are designed to be productive for 100 years. That means both in terms of carbon capture, efficient carbon capture, and the income piece that I keep coming back to. This is quite a departure from historical approaches as well. Most tropical reforestation projects are relatively short-lived. Again, it's the idea is you grow a forest and cut it down. That's how you make your money, and ideally plant again. But that's never a guarantee. So we wanted to create a long-term project that will be, will make sense for these landowners and also the sponsors of the forests, as well as the global commons. And all of our forests are mixed species models. We've tried to find a balance between the natural forest analog that I mentioned earlier and the monoculture approach. We tend to plant maybe 8 to 10 species, and then over the course of that first 25 years, another 3 to 5 might be introduced. I am finding, though, in some recent projects that both landowners and forest sponsors are willing to forego some carbon capture on the forest sponsor side and some income on the landowner side to have a more biodiverse forest. So in the past 3 years, sorry, we've had 2 100-hectare projects that have at least 30 species. So we're getting close to that natural analog approach. But just to highlight the differences here, on the left is a Reforest the Tropics project, and the right, another a photo of a Malina plantation in Costa Rica. Of course, when you have biodiversity in your flora, it invites the same with your fauna. The habitat creation was never a primary goal of the project. However, we've been pleasantly surprised to see that our forests are hosting just about every known species in Costa Rica, including the megafauna of the tapir, which are very rare. Jaguars, also very rare. We've seen great green macaws, which are on the endangered list within our forests. There was a threatened tortoise that was found about 7 years ago. I did not take a photo of that, but again, we're seeing just about everything, including endangered and threatened species. I did want to mention that we have planted some forests for Rockport High School as well, working with Mr. Waller in the past. This was through donations of a Gloucester family, the Hintlian family. And we were able to establish 2 individual hectares in Costa Rica in 2017 and 2018. For those that aren't aware, a hectare is 2.5 acres. And these forests will, in that first 25-year contract period, will sequester at least 1,000 metric tons, probably closer to 1,200. Here's a photo. This photo is relatively old. I haven't been to this site to take a photo probably this is a little over a year ago. You can see I'm still in full pandemic mode. Get a little bit more into the economics of our program because it is so important. I'd mentioned that we're competing with cattle. So if we start at the bottom, that's our target. A well-run cattle well-run cattle farm in Costa Rica generates about $400 to $500 per hectare per year. So if we can create a project that competes with that, well, that is really revolutionary in terms of how we're able to engage these landowners. So how we accomplish that is we pay the farm $3,000 per hectare as an initial gift or contribution for participating in this project. Now, the rest of this income comes through selective harvesting, what we call forest thinnings. A lot of people bristle when we talk about thinnings because it is cutting down trees, but if we didn't care about the income piece at all, this would still be absolutely critical for the health of the forest for the long term and our carbon capture. I don't know, perhaps some of you may have experience with gardening. If you plant 2 tomato plants close together, both are going to suffer and you're not going to get as many tomatoes. Well, the same thing happens in a forest. Initially, we do have to plant these trees somewhat close together to sort of minimize our management costs. But as these trees grow and they start to compete with one another, the entire forest stand will stagnate if we do not remove some of those, those trees. Typically in a silvicultural approach, you'll see maybe 35 to 40% of a forest being removed in a thinning. And that's done every 10 years or so, depending on the species. We take a much lighter approach. So we are removing about 15% of our volume. We try to do that every 5 to 6 years. The forest will, the measurements that we do annually will actually indicate to us when that annual growth is starting to drop, and that signals that it's time for a thinning. So if we're planting the right trees, we then have a product for these farmers. So each one of the species that we include in our mixtures is designed for a specific purpose. Some of them are designed for the long-term carbon capture. Some are designed to be fast growing, like those eucalypts that I showcased earlier. Those are short-term residents in our forest. Those grow so fast that we can cut those, within the first 2 thinnings, and they're gone by, either 12 or 15 years. And then we have a number of intermediate species. Some are really valuable timbers. Some are, the timber may not be quite as valuable, but the specific gravity is really high, and they're really great at accumulating carbon. And based on our research over decades, we know which species can interact with their neighbors, and that's how we're able to design our mixed species forests that are solving this problem of how to create an economically sensible model for landowners, but using a mixed species approach. We're also finding that our forests are benefiting local communities beyond the farm. So every 15 hectares that we plant, we are creating 1 full-time permanent job. And then, of course, there's a number of other ancillary benefits to reforestation. There's improved air and water quality, recreational opportunities, and aesthetic beauty. We're always trying to improve on that. So the heart of Reforest the Tropics is research. Our design was to create a better model, one that's accessible to landowners, but is ecologically responsible. So some of the things that we're doing to make this more attractive to landowners, while actually being able to enhance the biodiversity, is some of our agroforestry research. So if we can create models that are able to generate additional income in other ways, we can skew our model towards more biodiversity. In other words, we don't have to plant our forests with such strict restrictions on, those species for intermediate income, as an example. So in the early years, we found that we can plant a number of different crops, and not only does it provide additional income for the farm, but it also reduces management costs. We're, in that photo to the right there, if that corn wasn't there, there'd be weeds growing there, and we would have to mechanically or in some cases chemically control those weeds. There's a lot of intensive management in a young tropical forest. Competition is quite fierce. So by planting certain crops, we can eliminate those costs and again, create another source of income. And then we're hoping to actually start introducing sheep to some of our older forests. And the idea is that, well, if you have larger animals, it'll damage the roots, but sheep can actually survive in under a tropical forest canopy, eat the competing vegetation, and again, you'd have another product for the farm in those later years. One final point of mine is that we also are working on an education program here in New England. It's primarily focused in Connecticut and Rhode Island. But over the years, we've reached nearly 40 schools, over 12,000 students. Now with Rockport High School and others, we have 14 different schools that are offsetting their carbon footprint through our forests. And somewhat exciting for us is we recently launched a program where we're actually connecting the students to our forests, and typically not me there, but one of our foresters in real time. So the students are able to ask questions of our forester about climate change, about forestry, about life in Costa Rica. It's been really exciting. So that's another part of our program that we're hoping to see grow, in addition to planting more trees. So that concludes my presentation. In summary, we need tropical reforestation. There's really no way around it if we're going to be serious about climate change. It's a very cost-effective, safe, and proven technology. If you've come across some other articles about other negative emissions technologies or just climate change technologies in general, some of them are carbon capture and storage. So that's capturing CO2 at the emission source, liquefying it and putting it underground. We've seen ideas such as fertilizing the oceans, any number of different approaches that may or may not work. I mean, I don't have the expertise to really comment on it, but I do know that tropical reforestation is an age-old, or reforestation in general is an age-old practice that has so many additional benefits beyond the climate change piece. We do know that we need an approach that's more biologically sustainable than monocultures and more economically sustainable than the natural forest analog approach, which typically requires a great deal of subsidies, because we need these landowners to participate, but also not just planting one species. We do need a healthy ecosystem. So our work has been to find that balance and really change the way, the potential of tropical reforestation, both in terms of carbon capture potential and ecological sustainability. And I'll open it up for any questions that anybody might have. I'm going to stop my share here.
Wow, thank you, Greg. It's fascinating stuff, and I love the shout out to Rockport High School. I think most people there have forgotten that they have this hectare of land being forested there in Costa Rica.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier that I do owe you a report. So we don't start measuring our forests. They're too small to measure until the 4th year. So we're just coming up on that now. And we'll have some carbon capture figures for you annually moving forward from here on out.
That'd be great. Something to celebrate. A question from Mike Deneen. You seem to be muted, Mike, even though it says you're not.
I'm not getting anything.
No? Nope. So he's
There's a chat option if you want to. I can,
right.
if you want to type.
Try one more time, Mike, and then I'll move to the chat. Okay. Linda Goldberg says, I haven't heard any talk about reforestation in the US. We seem to love malls, plazas, single-family homes, and never consider returning land to forest. Are there any programs in the United States? Is it ever considered?
So there is quite a bit of reforestation that's happening in the United States. I had mentioned before the albedo effect and the growth rates of trees in the tropics. But I think it stands to reason that trees grow considerably slower in the United States. So more importantly, in terms of climate change, is the albedo effect. What we've learned is, the further north, or the further away from the equator, I suppose is better put, the impact of of reforestation lessens. I had used the extreme example of a boreal forest supplanting, tundra or grasslands in Canada. But that phenomenon actually, it is true in the temperate regions as well. So the carbon capture that we'll have in, say, Massachusetts, is meaningful, but it is offset by the albedo effect, and is not a terribly efficient way to deal with climate change. In the tropics, it's a little bit different. We do have the albedo effects. These dark canopies do absorb some of that extra energy that would not otherwise be absorbed on a lighter cattle pasture, for example. But tropical forests have an additional effect where they generate a lot of cloud cover. So you have that really light, white clouds that are reflecting a lot of that energy back into space, which more than counteracts the albedo effect. My take on it, the quick personal aside, is we should be reforesting everywhere other than that extreme example of the boreal zones. But yeah, reforestation has so many other benefits beyond climate change that, yes, I'm wholeheartedly in support. And there are efforts, not by Reforest the Tropics.
Is this working yet?
Oh, yes, Michael, I can hear you.
Aha, miracle of miracles. Two things I typed in: the jaguars will love the sheep, which.
Yes, so that's why we haven't done it yet. We have not figured that piece out.
And I come across uses for exotic and endangered woods all the time. Violin bows for Pernambuco and ebony, and these are high profit trees. Is there a market there? Is there an opportunity to introduce exotic species along with whatever you have growing?
Yes, there is. We do. I should have made this clear. We do use two exotics within our model. The rest are natives. One of the exotics that we use is called Araucaria hunstanii, commonly known as clinky. This is a tropical conifer that is one of the true forest giants. It grows to, in its native Papua New Guinea, we found examples of 270-foot trees, right? Compare that with the redwoods at about 320. I mean, it's a massive, massive tree. That's what we rely on for our long-term carbon capture. And I should note, though, that it's completely naturalized. It was introduced to Costa Rica in the 60s, completely non-invasive, and has been shown to support habitat for local fauna. The other exotic that we use are eucalyptus, also from Southeast Asia and the Philippines. But again, we include those to try and get some early income. There's actually no native species that can do what eucalypts do. There's fast growing trees, but they don't have the value on the market, or some fast growing trees have some value, but their canopies are so dense that it stunts the growth of their neighbors. Eucalypts have a really light canopy, so there's just no substitute for them that we've discovered in decades of research. Now, to address your question, we are trying to limit our use of exotic species. Personally, I don't really have an issue with it. I mean, when you think about what we're replacing, it's exotic cows or exotic coffee, or any other type of agricultural product is typically exotic, as are the people. So as long as you're not damaging the environment, I have no problem with it. But for a smaller nonprofit like us, I think people are always throwing darts, shooting arrows at us, and maximizing the use of natives is one way to sort of insulate ourselves from that. And there are enough really highly valuable native species in Costa Rica where we can achieve many of the same goals. We plant mahogany, for example.
I was not throwing darts or anything. I was thinking
no.
per board foot, No,
I mean, personally, I would. I'd love to try any number of species, because again, climate change is so important that we can't be quibbling over, well, is this tree, as long as it's not invasive and damaging the environment in other ways. I say, yeah, let's experiment. We really have to find a solution to this issue.
Thank you.
Bill Wall?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks so much for your talk. It's you're doing exciting and really important work there. So I was wondering how I'm going to put a couple of links here in the chat. How what you do could dovetail with reversing desertification, because there are some interesting articles on that. And there was this TED talk given by Alan Savory like 9 years ago. You might be familiar with it. Where he says that rousing animals can actually help spur the growth of vegetation and help reverse desertification. So your work must in some way address that or deal with that.
So our laboratory is Costa Rica, and it's an ideal lab as we could hope for our type of work. But our ambitions, our goals are to create a model that is replicable throughout the tropics and addresses some of those issues like desertification. So we're at the point now where our research is pretty solid, and we're focusing more towards deployment, large scale deployment of our model. I've been reaching out to people in Nicaragua, Indonesia, Honduras, and specifically to your point of desertification, somebody approached me from Haiti not too long ago, and Haiti has been deforested for so long that desertification has set in. And my response at the time was, our project is not, we don't personally have the expertise there. I think that there's other groups that are better suited for reversing desertification. The animal approach, actually, it makes sense. But, my understanding is you have to start with you have to have patience for one. So some pioneer species, either, certain limited species of trees, shrubs, things like that. And maybe 10 years down the road, you can get enough relative humidity where you might be able to try some other species, and et cetera, et cetera. But it's a long process, and yeah, it's not in our wheelhouse.
Okay.
Thanks.
A note from a chat from Eleanor Harris. Does RTT have any connection with La Ruta? Don't we need to push personal responsibility to cut beef consumption to help reduce deforestation? And notes that it's exciting work you're doing.
Yeah, no, thank you. The quick answer is no. We have no connection with La Ruta. I agree with the larger point. Yes, the beef consumption is, again, an ancillary part of what we're doing. Our first priority is cattle farms. And a big part of that is to remove some of the, the head of cow that are on the planet, and create an alternative that makes the same amount of money. The bad news is, I think with the pandemic, beef prices, especially in Costa Rica, have skyrocketed, and I think elsewhere in the world. So that conversation with these farms is becoming that much trickier. But those markets are dynamic, and we expect in the future our reforestation model will be able to better compete again. This year we are planting 105 hectares, and about 95 of those are over cattle pasture, and the remaining 10 were an abandoned coffee farm.
And you probably have some information on certain corporations who have bought into your model. Is that correct?
Yes. Well, yeah, I think I can share some names. So our biggest historic supporter has been a company out of Cambridge called Superior Nut Company. I'd mentioned the Hindley and family who supported the Rockport Forest earlier. That is owned by the Hindley and family. They've been with RTT for 20 plus years. Lauren Hindleyan, the sustainability director for Superior Nut Company, is the president of our board of directors. Harry Hindleyan, her father, was our longtime benefactor. He passed away, unfortunately, a couple of years ago. So they've I want to be careful, but they've put in millions of dollars into this project over the years. And my understanding is because of their participation in this, and because they're balancing actually 200% of their emissions, they're attracting a lot of interest from their buyers. Ben and Jerry's and Walmart, for example, are buying a lot more of their nuts and nut products because of their sustainability record. So my understanding, again, is that their investments into tropical reforestation have more than paid off through increased sales, which is the idea, right? If we can create a model that works for the forest sponsors, works for the farms, and works for the global community, we're on the right track. We just entered into an agreement with an Ipswich, Massachusetts company called New England Biolabs. This is their second 100-hectare project with us, and we're really proud of that relationship. We have a number of other, medium to small businesses, a lot of individuals, universities, schools, civic groups, and families that have sponsored forests with us over the years. We have right now, hold on, I'm going to take a peek so I don't have my project list right here. Right now we have 102 projects with 83 different donors on 15 different farms in Costa Rica.
And this also can serve as a model for towns and municipalities to offset their carbon production.
We've spent a lot of time with towns and municipalities thinking it was a great solution. What we found ultimately is that there's hesitation to use public funds outside of the country because our model doesn't work in the United States. We've never found anybody that's willing to balance in that manner. I have looked at Hawaii to try and get around that, but the project economics just don't make quite as much sense there. We can't make it attractive enough a cost to the project sponsors to be able to, to make it work.
So any other questions?
I got a question. Greg, the reforestation effort, I've seen the video, things about what they're cutting down in Brazil. It
Yeah.
looks like they're clear cutting the whole damn forest. And I'm trying to wrap my head around the magnitude of you're trying to capture carbon or take it out of the atmosphere. And this is affected by the global warming issue, where if you got too much carbon in the atmosphere, CO2 in the atmosphere, you get a heating up effect by absorbing the sunlight. If you can't do it here on Earth because of, hey, you can't control all these different companies that are polluting basically, and between the cow farts and people eating, I've seen them growing meat in the laboratory. That's a new thing they're trying to do now. But maybe we have to try to go into outer space and put up a sun shield to be able to cut down the sunlight until we can figure out the best way to avoid polluting the atmosphere that's absorbing all the sunlight. I give you a lot of credit for making an effort, but it's like carrying coals to Newcastle. It's almost a Herculean attempt. And I'm kind of frustrated and horrified at the pace at which things are going in the wrong direction. And I've said my piece. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, no, and you're right. So I think, how I respond to that is I think what we're trying to do at RTT is find a way to make forestry work for landowners. So what you're seeing with deforestation is, well, for one, there's money to be made in cutting those trees down and selling them. But then I'd mentioned the rising price of beef. So, all right, well, beef's going up. Let's cut our forest down and raise cattle on this land. Well, if I can create an economic model that makes sense for these landowners, I think that there's a better chance anyways. We stand a chance. And yeah, despite what you're seeing, we're still net negative on deforestation, but we're closing that gap. We really are. And the hope is, in the next few years, we'll actually be planting more trees than we're cutting down across the globe. A lot of governments are getting involved. So Northern Europe, for example, is investing huge amounts of money in historically problematic countries like Indonesia, like Brazil, to incentivize them to not only keep their forests, but to plant more.
I admire you. Thank you very much for your efforts.
Thank you.
And good luck on all of it. It's certainly going to be a project to keep you busy your whole career.
I hope so. I do. I love what I do.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
One last question on my part. How does RTT relate, if at all, with the Trillion Tree Project?
Yeah, we're a part of, we're on the list.
Okay.
There's a lot of planters on that list. So I haven't seen a whole lot come from it, but
Okay.
we do report to a number of different groups like that are tracking, how much reforestation is happening.
Well, it sounds like a viable project. It's research-based, and you're really trying to work within the population that's there and within the biosystems that are there as well. So are there any other questions?
I just want to remark very briefly that the whole idea that capitalism could save the planet deserves a lot of skepticism.
Our resident Marxist here.
Yes.
Spoken like a poli-sci major.
Outstanding to hear your presentation.
Thank you
Very
so much.
exciting.
Um, I can leave, I'm not sure exactly how, but I can leave my contact information if anybody wants to follow up and ask more questions or just follow what we're doing. We have a presence on social media. If you want to look up Reforest Tropics, our website, et cetera.
Right.
But my contact information can be found through our website.
Mhm.
So feel free to reach out at any time.
Okay, good. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Call it an evening.
All right.
Have
Take
a
care.
good time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.